Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I spend most of my time as an author and screenwriter and very creative person all round, but I also direct the centre. So that's what I'm doing here. And joining me today is regular co-presenter Jacob Rennaker, who is sitting over in, I think it's Seattle, isn't it, Jacob?
It is.
Yeah. And Jacob is a Tolkien expert and also involved in the creation of board games. So having a sort of different creative expression of fantasy. Okay, so what are we talking about today? Well, I've been thinking about orcs, as one does. And they are quite a problematic aspect of Tolkien's world in many ways. So I thought we would devote today's podcast to a deep dive into the world of orcs. So just before we get into the Lord of the Rings version of orcs, I just want to go back to the origin of the word, because some people may not realize that the actual word comes from Old English. Of course it does. We're talking about Tolkien. And if you go to the Encyclopedia Britannica and look up orc, you find there are two roots for the name, and both are interesting. So the one which is less relevant to Tolkien is that orc is a reference to a sea monster, which is from the French orc or the Italian orca, which all comes from Latin, which is why one of the words for a killer whale is an orca. So there's an element of like a sea monster somewhere floating around in that meaning. But Tolkien himself probably reached for the Old English version of this, which means a demon or an ogre. And it appears in Old English in compound words such as Orkneas, which means monsters, in the poem Beowulf, which we all know was one of Tolkien's favourite and one he spent much scholarly time pondering. Possibly there is some derivation from the Latin word orcus, a god of the underworld. So I think it's that side of the English language that Tolkien was drawing on, but it does mean that he was, as ever, finding a new meaning for a very old word. So, Jacob, help us out. What are orcs when it comes to Tolkien's world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, Tolkien, being very familiar with Norse myth as well, the Jotun, the giants in Norse mythology, and we had a whole conversation, you and I,
We've done
about
giants.
giants. Yeah. So one of the terms that's used for giants, Theirs, I believe, was translated in Old English using that term, the orc. So there's a tie between giants, otherworldly creatures associated with darkness, underworld, death, and orcs. So yeah, there's the natural connection there. So Tolkien, it's interesting because one of the things that we see in The Hobbit is that we don't have orc really there, that you have goblins instead, right? And we're told in The Hobbit that goblin is used kind of synonymously with orc, and it's actually said to be a translation. Goblin is used as a translation of orc, and so there doesn't seem to be kind of like a clear distinction between these as species, goblin versus orc. So it can get kind of confusing.
Yeah, can we pause there? Because actually, I think goblin has a very different root. So if you look at Victorian fantasy, like The Princess and the Goblin, so those books, goblin does seem more of a folk story figure that's been around. And orc seems to be coming a little bit from the outside, from the cold of Beowulf, and way back in medieval time, Middle English times. No, Old English times. Sorry, get this right. So I don't buy that as a thing. I feel as though that's not a great translation, because the goblins in The Hobbit do behave more like goblins than orcs with their songs and their, they're a bit more cheery.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so you have in Two Towers, you have like goblin soldiers that are
Yeah,
specifically referred to, right? But goblins, whereas I think traditionally in that broader like Victorian era that goblins are kind of smaller, but
yeah.
here in Two Towers, the goblin soldiers are said to be of greater stature. Like so they're like larger. So it's tough. I don't know. I would love to see a taxonomy of orcs in general and goblins and other fell beasts and
Okay, so
creatures.
we'll just accept that even if there is a bit of a Victorian blend happening here, that what we think of as goblins under the mountain in The Hobbit are in some way related to orcs.
Yes, right.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we'll accept that, and we'll move on to Lord of the Rings. So let's talk about where they come from, because I know this isn't an easy question. So are orcs, and we're not talking about Uruk-hai yet, are orcs ruined elves?
Yeah, I get it depends. It depends on where you're dipping into Tolkien's writings, right? Like the earliest origins for orcs, right? Book of Lost Tales is describing orcs or goblins, right? So sometimes Tolkien's using those interchangeably. Are they're coming from stone, right? They're coming from like subterranean heat and slime, and it says their hearts were of granite and their bodies deformed. So they almost seem to be like made out of clay, right? They're
So a bit
dirt
like
that
dwarves that went a bit wrong or something.
exactly. No, and there's the parallel there, and that comes in a little bit later, kind of like as Tolkien is teasing out the theological implications of orcs, is comparing them to dwarves, right, which are different types of creation and sub-creation, and who's creating them and who's allowed to create and who can give life in Tolkien's world. That's a big issue in Tolkien's mind, and why I don't think he ever kind of finally settles down on a specific origin for orcs in the big picture. But from the beginning, so possible origins, earliest conceptions that Tolkien has are they're just kind of made from stone, kind of like and from the earth. But from the ickier places of the world, hotter, slimier
Yeah.
places, whereas maybe Aule is taking the nice prettier clay that has really nice tones, maybe some streaks of different colors in there, because he's a craftsman, so he's probably taking greater care, whereas Melkor is just kind of really just
So
slapping
slapping it all
together. And
together. Yeah.
yeah, right.
Okay,
He,
so
he
that's a
just needs
possibility. And
a
the
possibility.
underlying principle here is in Tolkien's theology, and actually in surely in our world too, that the origin of life is very difficult to pinpoint. And within his theology, only Eru Iluvatar should be creating life. So when the dwarves are created sort of, by on the side, Eru kind of steps in and kind of puts them to sleep for a bit, doesn't he, until the
Yeah,
elves are awake, because they were going to be the first people. So there's a kind of ordering of who creates life, which is where the idea that the orcs can't be just, snap my fingers and a new race comes to be. The orcs, in a way, have to come from somewhere.
right.
And so that's why it's not clear. And one of the things that is said is that and I think it's mentioned again in some of the film versions, isn't it? That they were elves once, possibly, who wandered off in the
Yeah,
darkness and got bent and twisted.
right. There's definitely a relationship to elves in some way, shape, or form. So after kind of chronologically, if you start out with Tolkien seeing orcs as created from stone, granite, heat, slime, then in Quenta Silmarillion of 1937, you have orcs, specifically says that Morgoth is creating orcs after Morgoth had seen the elves and was making them in mockery of the children of Iluvatar. So they're not in this version in 1937. They're not deformed elves, but he's kind of copying elves. He sees these elves and he's like making them not just as a copy, but again, like in mockery of the elves. So like he's doing, oh yeah, you can do this. Yeah, I can do it, but worse. And so, but they're still made of stone in that version. They're still not kind of made out of the same flesh and blood. But then you have the Annals of Aman in the 1950s. When Tolkien's putting together, and you see that's where we start having the overtones of elves that have been corrupted and twisted. So that's kind of where you're first seeing that enter into Tolkien's, at least in writing.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that late. Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah.
So yeah, and so here's from the passage there. It says, all those of the Quendi, the elves that came into the hands of Melkor ere Autumno was broken, were put there in prison, and by slow arts of cruelty and wickedness were corrupted and enslaved. Thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of the Orcor, which as they were called at that time, in envy and mockery of the Eldar, of whom they were afterwards the bitterest of foes. And then this is actually what's then adapted. What follows here is adapted in the published Silmarillion that Christopher Tolkien publishes. So some of this other language that follows will be a little bit more familiar. Right, it says that in their deep dark hearts, the Orcor loathed the master whom they served in fear, and maker only of their misery. And then it talks about this maybe was the vilest deed of Melkor and the most hateful to Eru. So this was seen as like being a very bad thing, because he's taking existing life and then twisting it to these perverse ends. And so that's seen as greater than him just creating something out of stone and being a mockery in the image of. This is actually dealing with life itself, living beings, and that's despicable in this particular, kind of theological framework.
So before we go and talk about the different kinds of orc under that umbrella, do we have any idea how they reproduce? Because none of the orcs that we meet seem female. They may be, I don't know. They could be gender fluid or whatever. But is there any sense of, are they in a laboratory? Are they spawned like, larva? Or do we know?
This is a good question. Well, in that same passage, it says, again from this early the Annals of Aman, that then is adapted into the Silmarillion section that talks about orcs. It says the Orcor had life and multiplied after the manner of the children of Iluvatar. So there's a suggestion that they're reproducing biologically there.
Okay, so there's going to be some kind of ability to have orc babies somewhere in the which is quite interesting to think about.
Right.
Okay, and within that, do we have any sense how long they live, any of that kind of thing? So obviously, if they are after the children of Iluvatar, they have a sense of they live an awful long time, or are they more like dwarves who live extended lifetimes but do die?
And that again, it appears to be that's an issue that Tolkien's trying to work through, because if they are derived from elves, then they're going to have this serial longevity, right? That they're essentially made of the same stuff. But because they have been twisted, do they have more limitations placed on them, like dwarves, where they can live longer lives? We have examples, and we can talk later about some of the specific orcs that we have named in different works. But one of them is referred to, right? Gorbag says that he lived longer than regular orcs did. So there's, at least there we see that orcs have a particular lifespan, and that this one had a longer lifespan than most.
Yeah, though one suspects there isn't much of a retirement plan for an orc. So it could be that he's a survivor and hasn't been killed off in some.
Exactly. Right.
So
exactly.
Yeah. So we don't know, I think was an element that's probably.
Yeah. And this depends also. So one of the other avenues that you have that Tolkien is playing with even in that passage that I mentioned here that said that orcs were kind of twisted from elves and then multiply after the manner of the children of Iluvatar, is in the margins, Tolkien wrote, alter this, orcs are not elvish.
Okay.
So he's written both. But that was afterwards. There's the idea, right, that so are they sentient? They're clearly sentient, but there's you have the this idea of soul, of a rational soul, this thear, that living creatures have, and animals and different types of animals have different degrees of, it's kind of like sliding scale of sentience, right? So you have Huan, you have as a dog,
The talking
who
dog,
is
one of my
a
favorite characters.
very good dog, right?
Yeah.
Who has, right, so he's an animal, but he has speech and like volition, and then you have that similarly with the eagles as well, right? So they seem to be set apart from the natural kind of regular beast of the
And the
field.
dragons, they also speak.
Right. Yeah. So this is messy, and so to complicate things further, then you have in an appendix to an essay on the Quendian Eldar that Tolkien's writing in 1959 and 60. He says here that there's a cogent point, the horrible to relate. It became clear in time that undoubted men could, under the domination of Morgoth and his agents, in a few generations be reduced almost to the orc level of mind and habits, and then they would or could be made to mate with orcs, producing new breeds, often larger and more cunning. So you have kind of interbreeding between different species, not just elvish or elf race, but that there's like some sort of crossbreeding that's happening with different
but
groups.
That would follow if there is some connection to the elves, because of course elves and men can have children. Right. So okay, well, so we've got we can live with a little bit. We can live with some uncertainty there, but we can see what he's reaching for. He's sort of thinking about these in some way as a spoiled creation. That seems to be a constant thing here. Okay, so going sort of the next level down is one of the things that's very interesting as you read Lord of the Rings, is to get a sense of the politics within the world of Orcdom, where you've got Saruman perhaps breeding with men. I don't know, but he's producing a super race, isn't he? The Uruk-hai, who are able to travel under daylight and are bigger and stronger, and they're the ones who run off with Merry and Pippin back to, or try to get back to Orthanc. And we've got I suppose the original flavor orcs who come out of Mordor. So if we give them names, if you're referring to that passage, the original flavor orc is Grishnak and the Uruk-hai is Ugluk. And there's clearly tension between those two groups. And they all look down on the orcs who are coming out of the Misty Mountains to avenge their captain. So there does seem to be a bit of politics within the orcs. Now we can see where the Uruk-hai are coming from, because this, you can imagine Saruman applying his magic to that problem and doing a bit of bioengineering. And we can see the Mordor orcs, but then you go to the next level down when you get with Sam and Frodo into the borders of Mordor. You find that the original flavor orcs are also hugely divided by their jobs and where they're stationed. So you've got the two orcs who are the ones carrying Frodo into the tower at Cirith Ungol, who are, and then there's a big punch up and they kill each other, the two sets of orcs. But also
Shagrat and Gorbag, which
thank
are
you.
great names.
Yeah. And then there are two unnamed orcs, I think, a bit later on, who Sam and Frodo overhear, who are tracking them, and they are called the Soldier and the Tracker. One's like snuffling along the ground, and the other one is sort of like leading him in a way. It's like his kind of minder. It's almost like a dog owner type thing, except they talk to each other. So Tolkien really did think through. His orcs aren't all one kind of orc. There's a whole series of a sense of a community, if that's the right word. But there is a sense of a realpolitik of orcs that gives them a little bit more definition than just the, the massed armies in you see on the screens when there's a battle sequence in any of the films or whatever. Are there any named orcs outside Lord of the Rings, like in the Silmarillion? I couldn't think of one, but that may be just my ignorance.
I couldn't think of any.
There is the one who from The Hobbit who kills the one who became a hero character, a hero orc character in the films. Sorry, I'm forgetting his name. He's the one who Thorin has the big set 2 battle with. So I think there is a couple there whose names are plucked from the history of the dwarves, but there isn't really a lot of focus on orcs in Silmarillion, is there? They seem to be, less of a problem. I mean, they are the last ranks, but they're not. They tend to be more interested in fighting dragons and other sorts of things in the First Age. Yeah. Okay. Right. So moving on, before we talk about the actual characterization of orcs, let's deal with the problem of orcs, which is the way Tolkien has written about the orcs and the period in which he is writing. People have begun to relate it across to the whole sort of eugenics movement and sort of ideas of racism, the tarring of everybody of the same brush who's of one race, the lack of differentiation. Is everybody really all bad in this race? That stuff. Do you have any thoughts on that at all? Do you think that he's a man of his era, of course?
He is.
But should we be worried about accepting this great raft of characters as bad guys just because who they're born?
Yeah, I think this is what one of the issues that Tolkien had, especially later in life, as he's thinking through the theological implications of orcs and their sentience. Again, are they living? So what happens when orcs die? Right. So if they have a rational soul, if they're derived from elves and they're elvish, and that means that they're taken to Mandos, to the halls of waiting, or like that and then they could be are they rehoused into another body? Are they not? Is there some sort of judgment placed on them? That's what he's trying to figure out. And because if they are rational, if they do have will, and they're not inherently evil, then what does that mean? And so I think he seemed to be very uncomfortable with just having them all pure evil, that because they were life, even though it was corrupted life, that it was still life nonetheless, that came from ultimately the creation of Ero Iluvatar, right? That there's something that can't be completely evil in them. And so I think, so he was wrestling with that question even till the end. So I think you see the depictions even in people, I think you referenced this before, Julia, is Lewis's response to that. I don't know if you want to speak to Lewis's review of The Two Towers and how he dealt with people already, fans already having kind of a backlash to Tolkien saying that he's too black and white. What were you thinking about there?
No, I mean, C.S. Lewis was a very sensitive reader to Tolkien. I mean, admittedly, some of their language now we would find used differently. So using swarthy as a sort of negative term, for example. But putting that aside and allowing them to be men from the middle of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis goes on to say, I think some readers seeing and disliking this rigid demarcation of black and white imagine they have seen a rigid demarcation between black and white people. Looking at the squares, they assume, in defiance of the fact, that all the pieces must be making bishops' moves, which confine them to one colour. But even such readers will hardly brazen it out through the last 2 volumes. Motives, even on the right side, are mixed. And he goes on to say, those who are now traitors usually began with comparatively innocent intentions. Heroic Rohan and Imperial Gondar are partly diseased. Even the wretched Smeagol, till quite late in the story, has good impulses, and by a tragic paradox, what finally pushes him over the brink is an unpremeditated speech by the most selfless character of them all. He's referring to, Sam, sort of talking about him sneaking off, that bit. So I think that he was aware. I think, put it like this, if Tolkien was writing today, he would completely clear away any association that we have with a sort of black and white people aspect to make sure it's absolutely clear, because he's not actually doing that. And he is, when you look at his people on the white squares in this they are veering around all over the chessboard. So you've got Denethor, for example, who's, doing a knight's move really rather than a bishop's move. So I think that's quite a good way of looking at it, to say, to not spoil your enjoyment of reading by thinking it's not actually it is more nuanced than you may think. And also I'm very pleased that any sort of visual versions of this that we've had in the 21st century have clearly chosen, let's not go down a skin tone route for these people. Let's make sure that they are sort of neutral in that sense. So you get, very chalk white orcs, and you get ones who look like they need a bit of sun, and you get some who are darker toned and leopard striped. That's the way to go, is to think it's let's not make it into a racial eugenics, let's not ruin orcs yet further by doing that to them. But it's good to be sensitive to it, because it
absolutely is. And it has, and to be completely fair, it has been used by fantasy authors who have picked up on orcs, the idea of orcs, in those sorts of ways that weren't nuanced. And I mean, but before going to that, the Silmarillion is written from the elves' perspective, right? And so it's of their concerns and where their minds are, what they're most concerned with. Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Tolkien was very intentional about the frame narrative, right? Who's writing it, where it's being translated from, right? Who's passing it on. So as a linguist and as a scholar, he was very concerned about sources, and aware that who is writing and transmitting and translating any story, that's going to filter what the end product is. So I think Tolkien was self-aware enough, like you were saying, Julia, that if it was written in these days, that he would be very painstakingly specific.
They'd all be blue, like Avatar.
Maybe you're right, yeah. So, but some people, I think, have used orcs as an excuse to perpetuate ideas of like an entire race, or to essentially give you license for a lack of nuance in a character. So the author N.K. Jemisin, who's written some really lovely fantasy and sci-fi works, somebody asked her why she didn't include creatures like orcs in her fantasy writings, and what she said was, and I think this gives a glimpse on like how orcs can be used in that very negative sense. She says, orcs are fruit of the poison vine that is human fear of the other. In games like Dungeons and Dragons, orcs are a fun way to bring faceless, savage, dark hordes into a fantasy setting and then gleefully go genocidal on them. And then she goes on to say that they're an amalgamation of stereotypes representing a kind of sort of people who aren't worthy of even the most basic moral considerations, like the right to exist.
Yeah, and it does become problematic when it leaks into the real world, because I have heard, understandable from the point of view of the suffering involved, but some of the social media talk about the Ukraine-Russia context, the war there, refers to the Russian army as orcs and Russia as Mordor. And you can see why they're reaching for that, but the danger is it misses out on the humanity of all the people involved in that conflict, even if they're in the wrong side of it. And that's why that it's problematic, because of course that's what the Nazis did to the people they didn't like. You treat them as subhuman, and therefore you don't have to worry about human rights. So I think always check what you're doing with orcs. That's why they're problematic. I think moving on from the racial aspect of this, because Tolkien's world is a world where sentient beings are more than one race. That's just the way he set up his fantasy. I think there is grounds for saying there is a classist aspect to the way he characterizes orcs. So you could actually look at it. If you're going to complain, you could say, why do they all speak like union reps who from sort of mining communities up north or something? There is an element of that. So when we do see the individual orcs arguing, there's a lot of sort of oi, gore, all that stuff. And when they do talk, it does sound like a union meeting that's gone wrong, where they're complaining to each other. So I'm just looking at in the Two Towers, when they're about to be struck down by Rohan, they're all sort of arguing about what they should be doing in their strategy. But it's all sort of in what I would call, it's quite a nuanced thing, but in English, it sounds like what you might do for a working class person. You, Lugdush, get 2 others and stand guard over them. They're not to be killed unless the filthy whiteskins break through. Understand? As long as I'm alive, I want them. But they're not to cry out, and they're not to be rescued. So it's kind of thug speak. Yeah, it's thug speak. So they don't, whereas all the, the refined Gondor people say, verily I deem that thou shalt do this, that, and the other. He's gone that way. And again, in The Return of the King, when we've got the really interesting insight to what the orcs know about the war, that's one of my favorite passages, when these unnamed orcs are talking. The big orc is saying, not much use are you, you little snufflers. I reckon your eyes are better than your snotty noses. Then what have you seen with them? Snarled the other. Gone. You don't even know what you're looking at. Who's to blame for that? Said the soldier. Not mine. That comes from higher up. And he goes on to explain the rumors that the common soldier is getting from what's happening over in Barad-dûr and elsewhere. So this is where it kind of humanizes is the wrong word, but you get a sense of their labor grumbles and their policies, and it does seem to me taken from like Garn, he's going for a working class commoners dialect for the orcs. So there you go, a little bit of issue there perhaps, but it's a translation, isn't it? Of course.
Yeah,
it's a translation, so we can blame the translator.
Right.
So do you have a favorite orc? So we've got Gorbag, Ugluk,
Shagrat, you got
Grishnak.
Lugberts,
Yeah.
Grishnak, yeah.
Do you have a favorite?
There's Snaga. Yeah, so it's interesting. I think so Snaga is sometimes used as like a derogatory term by Urukai for some of the other lower caste orcs, but it's also a proper name for one of the orcs who brings Pippin and Merry to Isengard, and the proper name of another orc who mistakes Sam for an elf warrior in the Tower of Cirith Ungol. So it's like the name like Steve or John, like a common name, right? So like what?
Well, maybe something like Titch or Maggot or something. In orc speak, I'm sure it means something like that. Yeah.
So
I think my favorite is I actually like Ugluk, because he is basically Aragorn of the Uruk-hai. He has, he's aware of his own greatness. We are the fighting Uruk-hai. He's got a real sense of his importance, which I rather like. Yeah. He sort of pontificates. You get a real sense of this commander who really thinks he's the bee's knees. So he's my favorite of all the orcs.
My favorite, well, yeah, I think the orcs, it's not in it, but it's not from the books. It's his unique to the film is Lurtz, who's that Uruk-hai nasty one that has the kind of one-on-one fight, the one who's, you know, peppering uh Boromir with arrows, and who has that one-on-one fight with Aragorn at the end.
Yes, he is very fine. I mean, we were doing the books, but because the other one in the Peter Jackson version is the commander figure who has the sort of very deformed head.
Yeah, yeah.
I've forgotten his
right.
name. Someone listening to this will know his name. But he again has his own. He's got, you know, you can see the POV, the point of view of that orc looking at his job has got to get done, and how all these idiotic Gondor cavalry are just riding into his guns. You know, you can see the world from his point of view, which makes them rise up to more of a rounded character. But those are inventions added in for the film, aren't they? I think.
Yeah, that's Gothmog, by the way.
Gothmog, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so moving on to the film versions, we've touched on how they've been characterized as trying to get away from a sort of skin tone shorthand, which would be objectionable. On the whole, the orcs from Mordor are less handsome, if we're allowed a sort of an orc handsomeness scale, whereas the ones from Orthanc are quite, you know, they've got some fine actors to sort of fill out those suits, shall we say, like Lurtz and others. So they're more handsome versions. Dipping back into The Hobbit, and this is where you need to Google again for me the name of the one who fights Thorin. He and his son both have quite a sort of big part in those films, trying to give their point of view. Is it Lurtz the son?
They have Azog.
Azog, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there was quite a lot of criticism of that character as well. People didn't warm to it as a I mean, there was some problems with an overextension of that series anyway, but I don't know. I don't think they really worked as well as the Lord of the Rings version of the orcs for some reason, and I can't work out why. Maybe it's because we don't. I don't know. I think the problem about those films is the real enemy is Smaug for most of the film, and then Smaug dies, and then we get the Battle of the Five Armies. That's one of the structural problems of The Hobbit, and which is seen as you go into a film, that it feels a bit broken backed. So the drama with the orcs or the goblins or whatever we're calling them is a bit disconnected from the Smaug threat. I don't know. So I can see why it was difficult to film. What would you have done?
I don't know.
You don't know. I don't know. I'd quite like to recut that film and just keep it to the Tolkien material and see what it looks like.
And there's people that have done that have done The Hobbit, the Bilbo cuts. They've done they've taken the all three films and cut it down to essentially the length of a single film, where it's really
I think I'd like that.
Hew closer. Yeah. Yeah.
As much as I like, you know, the acting and everything is, and the look and everything is fine. It's just somehow it doesn't quite mesh.
Yeah.
So moving from The Hobbit to the Rings of Power version of this, I actually think this is some of my favorite orc material, because the character who's like the spoiled elf who's trying to stand up for the orcs in that really interests me. He's one of the most interesting bad guys. Again, I'm going to have to Google his name.
Adar.
Adar, thank you. I don't know what's wrong with my brain today. I do. I've had a long day. That's what's wrong with it. But that to me seems to be a kind of, that's what you need to do with orcs if you're doing a modern writing. So well done the screenwriters there. Rather than just sort of drop in orcs as they were originally put into Lord of the Rings, if you're going to talk about more of their origins from the Second Age, that is the interesting stuff to do. Is they are fighting for their survival. It's taking those seeds of the industrial discontent of the Mordor orcs and looking at them earlier as they're founding their empire. So did you like Adar? Did you? enjoying that
Yeah, no,
character?
I did, and I liked the whole conversation. And there was, I can't remember if it was episode 7, when you have Adar when he's, tied up. Galadriel has, captured him, and
Mm,
he's kind of inside that barn, being tied up and talking to her, kind of telling her that, like, well, orcs are really, they're just elves. Really, we're all the
yeah,
same. And then he gives a theological argument, right? Uh, that we're all creations of Iluvatar. And so put on equal footing and say, why are you so much better than these living creatures? And so I think they do, you're right, the writers do raise some really interesting and I think significant moral questions there, and the difference between how much of a difference is there really between orcs and elves? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Right? Is it the
yeah,
environment that they're raised in? But they clearly have tendencies towards worship, right? So they're kind of treating this Adar character as you know quasi divine in a
yeah.
sense, right? They
High
they
priest
reverence
or
him.
something. Mm,
Yeah, and they have, so like when the in episode, I think it was 2, I don't know, 3, because
a
that's
bit
when you
later,
first see
yeah.
it. You see Adar at
Mm,
the end of 2. You see Adar's blurry at the end of 2, and then 3, or is it 3 and 4? But when you first see Adar, and then they're at the orc camp, when Arendir is captured with the other ones in that little kind of like slave camp where they're trying to hew down the trees. One of the orcs dies, right? And so you almost have like a funerary ritual that he does on them. So you have this kind of, which is a oddly tender moment, right? Where you see, or he was dying. No, the orc was dying, right? And then Adar like ends his life, but does so in a tender way. So it's kind of like a ritual death, end of life, where the orc wanted that to come from this character. So you have more of a sense of like a culture, right?
yeah,
A sense of a worldview that they're fitting within and that they're living within that is different from yours, but for them you see that it is compelling and encompassing in a way that they find meaning
yeah.
in a sense. And that's something that we haven't really seen before. So I like you, yeah, I did really appreciate seeing that from a kind of a cultural perspective.
Yeah, and then so just moving on slightly from the sort of screen versions, just we need to recognize that there are some book extensions of this, like the Stan Nichols series called Orcs. I haven't read it actually. I don't know. I was just reading about it and I was aware of it, and it seems to be like a fun satirical take with the orcs being the sort of boisterous heroes and the humans being you know the enemy. So, and you were mentioning you also see orcs in spin-offs in Dungeons and Dragons, and of course in
Mhm.
those kind of video games and so on. So people are asking those questions and finding out what they think an orc might be in other worlds, in other no other
Yeah.
fantasy worlds, should we say?
Well, and interesting about the Dungeons and Dragons, it was 2020 Dungeons and Dragons Wizards of the Coast kind of revisited their race system, right, for characters, and in 2021 specifically are talking about saying like races like orcs, goblins, and dark elves. Usually they were identified as typically evil,
Yeah.
right? It's just like the default is evil, but now it specifically says that any of those races, they may be good or evil as defined by how they're acting, and according to the will of the player that's playing them. So
Okay.
they're being more sensitive to some of those possible abuses of taking those races and essentializing them as evil, as
The other.
corrupt or whatever. Yeah,
Yeah. The
exactly.
ones you don't have to worry about.
Right, right.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you. I think we have done our deep dive into the problem of orcs, and I've certainly learned quite a few things. So I hope that's helpful to people who are listening. And we always end with where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place for something. And it's absolutely obvious that we have to decide where is the best place to be an orc. So, Jacob, have you had a chance to think about this? Where
I
would you
did,
like to be
and
an orc?
it's hard. And I think I have to say Middle Earth because it's Middle Earth. And like at least even if I was an orc, at least I would be in Middle Earth. It would be a
Yeah,
rough life.
okay.
It would be it would be hard. It would be difficult. I'd talk with, I'd sound like a union leader, and
You'd be
labor.
organizing the labor to the strike.
But at least like the
Yeah.
landscape, at least how Tolkien describes the landscape, like what I would be marching across and where I would be if I was a snuffler or whatever, at least the landscape would be gorgeous. So I'd have to content myself with
The
the
snuffling the
environment.
landscape. Yeah.
Yes, yes, exactly. That's where I came down. That's what I suppose I'd have to do. Because if
Okay,
it's the
so
only way I can get there, it's as an orc, so be it. I would go to Middle Earth, even if it
fine.
was just as an orc.
Yeah, it's like the worst economy class ticket you could get. Um,
Right.
I think I've been thinking about this, and I think that it's not much fun being an orc in Middle Earth because everyone hates you and they're trying to exterminate you. Um, and so I thought I'd go back to the original world of orc, to the Old English orc.
Mm.
And I would fancy being an orc, some monstrous demon figure living in the forests of Europe, a bit like, Grendel from Beowulf, just going about my orcish business in that kind of world. You might last a bit longer. And I might even turn myself into something like the Loch Ness Monster eventually, just kind of hide out in my monstrousness. So I'm going back to, those forests of Europe, to the origin of orc. Thank you, Jacob, for talking about the problem of orcs. And I look forward to talking to you next time.
Do you have, Julia, do you have a tip for us?
Oh, thank you for reminding me. Yes. So I think the relevant tip here is about how to write villains. And one of the things that the orcs present is the problem about having swathes of people who are villainous. One of my favorite quotes from Terry Pratchett is about Dark Lords, and he says Dark Lords should be rationed. And I think orcs are part of the same economy. You should ration the kind of number of orcs that you think up for your world. And if you want to write in a modern vein, think about the point of view of your characters who you've put as other, to make sure you're not falling into the trap of having a set of expendable people who are your cannon fodder. I just don't think our modern time likes that, wants that, and I don't think we should be doing that if they're sentient and all those things. So that is my tip, is to learn from the orcs that we'd have to write them differently today. How about you? Have you got a tip you want to share with us?
I do. I stumbled across something earlier this week, going back to Rings of Power and orcs there and how they're portrayed there. I mentioned last time the podcast series, the Rings of Power official podcast. So they had an episode with Bear McCreary, who does the composing for the series. Beautiful. He started doing a deep dive into his composition for each of the episodes on his blog. So bearmccreary.com. And you go to that main page and you can select, he has Lord of the Rings. Right now he's just on episode 1. But if you look at that, he talks through kind of the theory of coming up with those different themes. He has translations of the different, the music, people that you hear they're singing in Quenya. He has, English translation of the Quenya. He also has English translation of, you hear orcs chanting in the Black speech, and you have the English translation of that here, along with the full musical accompaniment. So if you want to, on your piano, so yeah, Julie, I see your piano behind you. You can turn around and just start playing the orcish chant. You can start start tickling the ivories there and singing your own Black speech. You can certainly do that, courtesy of bearmccreary.com. And it's fascinating. And if you enjoy it, it's really special seeing how much thought and care went into his crafting of the musical setting for the world. So just as much as you see how much care was put into the physical setting, right? The environment, the clothing and everything there. you can see that spelled out wonderfully here in the music. And it really helped me to gain a greater appreciation for what's being added there. So now as I'm re-listening to the soundtrack and as I see it, I'll certainly be doing so from a place that I'm enjoying, appreciating, and getting a lot more out of it.
That's a very good tip. Thank you for sharing that. And I will certainly be going and having a look at that myself. Right. So thank you for talking about the problem of orcs and for your special tip. And I look forward to speaking to you again next time.